Are we good? Dwayne, can you? There we go. It's got a mind of its own right now. Here we go. Hey, that worked out good. Sorry about that. We were messing with the microphone volume here. But thank you for coming this afternoon for our education meeting. It's a hearing and learning experience we're going to have today. A lot of people are coming in and out because there's about 4 meetings going on right now. And some people are leaving, believe it or not, to go all the way to South Georgia to get home. But we have our fine chairman of the Senate Education Committee, Senator, P.K. Martin. And P.K., if you'll come, just tell us your bill, and then we've got a lot of great folks that want to speak in defense and support. And for committee members, this is just a informal. If you have a question after each speaker, we'll stop and let you ask questions. And it's my goal here to make sure everybody understands what's going on, what it is. And I've learned a lot in the last month about it. And that's why we're doing this hearing, just to make sure that you know. And so we appreciate you being here, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. Does your committee have problems? I mean, are they scared of you? Is that why they're on the fringes over here?
Maybe.
Okay. Now, I really appreciate the opportunity to present SB 48. This is an issue that was given my attention by a good friend of mine during the off season, who happens to be here. She made me aware of the study committee that former Senator Fran Miller was putting on, and he learned a lot. And so I reached out to him when I realized he wasn't going to be able to come back and join us this year. And we had a long talk, and he kind of just filled me in on what was going on and the importance of it. I mean, it really struck him as hugely important. And I was really, at the same time, felt that same feeling. The issues we have, I'm trying to think of the right way. I want to go through this fairly quickly because I want to give everybody else plenty of time. I believe we're going to be going back to subcommittee right after this, and we're going to vet the bill in its details. But I want to go over a few things about it. The first thing is that it's estimated that it's around 20% of people struggle with some level of dyslexia, and these are great. These are people who are giants, have been giants. People like Steven Spielberg, you may have heard of him, Albert Einstein, Tom Cruise, Richard Branson, Pablo Picasso, and then my favorite, Henry Winkler of the Fonz, right? I mean, so you have a lot of people that have struggled with this, but once you struggle with it and once you understand it and when you can overcome it, you can really, these people tend to go a long way. I know they like to talk about it, and you might hear it in the future, but they like to talk about this as their superpower, and I do believe that's the case. These students, these people, they don't seek pity. They don't want us to feel sorry for them. They want to learn how to decode and understand the world in the way that it comes to them, the way that they decode it. They want to understand how to do this so that they can overcome and do great things just like those other people. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and just quickly go over the bill in very, very little detail. One thing that was interesting, there's no current mention of dyslexia in the Georgia Code. The first section here, beginning on line 21, well, the section begins on 16, but in line 21, that's where we set our definitions. We do define dyslexia on line 32. You're also going to see aphasia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia, all also defined in here. And you'll see why later. It's important that we have that designation, that we recognize what it is, and that we define it, and that we go ahead and set the warning signs and the characteristics of dyslexia, because that's what we're doing with this bill. We're trying to make sure that educators are aware of a student that may have these characteristics so that they can get them the tools and resources that they need to be able to overcome it and succeed. On line 80, that's where we go ahead and charge the Department of Education to make available, excuse me, I skipped ahead, my apologies. Line 48, we set the State Board of Education to develop policies for screening our kindergarten kids. And that goes down through line 79. In that process, we go ahead and we set, what the screening tool may be. There's a process for parents to provide informed consent. There's a process for parents to be able to decline the screening if they choose. And then, so forth and so on. Again, I know we'll get into more detail in subcommittee, and then we come back to the full committee, hopefully. On line 80 is where we have the dyslexia handbook. That's going to give guidance to school districts on definitions, how to treat, ways to make better ways to see children, see if they have these characteristics. We're putting that in their hands because I know that as a legislator, I'm not an educator. I'm an insurance guy. I know how to sell insurance. I know how to tell you about your insurance policy. I know that the people at the department, they are professionals and they know the best way to approach this. So we do give them some guidelines, but we want to make sure that they're setting those policies. Line 98, we have them going ahead and collaborating with the Professional Standards Commission to improve and update professional development opportunities for teachers, specifically relating to dyslexia. Again, the best thing about this bill is education of teachers, making sure that they're aware of how to not diagnose, that's the wrong word, how to find characteristics, to notice these characteristics, but also how to help these children, how to make sure they're getting the right tools they need. And then when you get to 114, that's where we start talking about the required screenings beginning in year 2020 to 21. Now, what I want to point out here, it does say we're starting year 2020 to 21. There's a pilot that's coming as well after this. This entire section is subject to appropriation. So I would not assume that we would appropriate for this until we were fully ready to implement this statewide. That's why we have the pilot program in there, and it's on line 139. You can see where it says this section shall be subject to appropriations by the General Assembly. Going statewide is going to be a big process, and so that's why we want to have a pilot first, so we can make sure that we work with these districts to create best practices, find out what works for Georgia, what works for rural, what works for suburban, what works for urban districts, so that we can make sure that when we are ready to roll out that we're going to do it well, because that's what we want to do. We want to do it well and serve these children. And that gets us to line 140, which is the 2-year pilot program. Again, the pilot is also subject to appropriations. We are trying in the Senate budget to get that appropriated in this budget so that we can go ahead and begin moving forward with that. And I have that number over here. We believe the cost is going to be around $250,000 to $500,000 to begin the process of setting up the pilot, and we're trying to get that. I'm trying to get that included in the budget. So I'm working with Chairman Hill on the Senate side to get that done. And then when you get down to Section 2 and Section 3, that deals with the PSC, that helps set up the requirements for the dyslexia endorsement. Again, this is going to allow current teachers to receive a dyslexia endorsement that's going to help them be trained in appropriately recognizing and responding to students with characteristics of dyslexia and language disorders, such as difficulty with expressive or receptive language. So again, I had a good conversation with the chairman. I know that he understands that at this piece, making sure teachers are more and more aware, making sure they're equipped. I know they want to help these kids. They want to make sure that these kids have the tools they need, and this is going to help them do that. And then finally, in Section 3, we have the PSC will set up standards for our pre-service teachers. So we're going to set this in their standards for their certification, which is going to allow pre-service teachers who are coming through our colleges and universities to have the same understanding when they enter the teaching world. So that's the bill. It's 7 pages. It's pretty long. We gave it a good, really worked on it a lot in the Senate. I look forward to continuing to work with your committee and hopefully moving this forward, and I will reserve the rest of the time for those that come behind me. Of course, I'll yield for any questions.
Well, certainly, thank you, and thank you for all the work you've done on it. It's very evident. Just start off, I have just one question, Senator. On line 98, we're talking about the Professional Standards Commission and developing opportunities. I guess when I read it, I thought we were talking about them creating you know, how teachers have to get recertified and add a number of credit hours to do that. Is that kind of what you're after here? You'd like for them to be a course that they can get and they can take to be, you know, to add it to that ongoing teacher education that goes on.
I mean, to me, that's correct. So when you're talking 98 to 113, you're talking they, you know, begin to work with the PSC to create that training for any teacher as they move forward. That's not necessarily the certification or the endorsement that we're talking about. It's slightly different than setting up the dyslexia endorsement, but this will be more of a you know, working with every teacher that's working with it, that could work with these students. Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we'll talk about that some more.
Both
okay,
for awareness and then also for...
Yeah, I didn't know if it would be just so, since they're on this, to create that module that teachers can take, and so we can talk to them about that.
I think they definitely could do that. I mean, I don't think we limit that.
Yeah.
They would definitely be within their...
Might have to tell them
to do that.
though.
Well, sometimes we have to tell them.
No, I'm just teasing. Now, 13, Ms. Doreen.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. First, I want to say thank you for this piece of legislation. The young lady that came to see me earlier, I share with her, my oldest son has dyslexia. And they were not, to your point, it's not in code. They were not even allowed to put it in his IEP or whatever thing is, that he was dyslexic, so he struggled. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate this bill. But what I don't see, and what I guess what I'm trying to, I understand the teachers being equipped and setting up the PSC, but if children have a diagnosis from their doctors, how will this bill help them at some point to be able to get the services? Because again, I mean, unless something changed, he's like 22 now, that you couldn't use the word dyslexia even though there was a diagnosis. So again, for those students, if we could work this bill, that's great. Your pilot is great, but in the interim, those kids who have been diagnosed, they need that extra. Will this bill in any way help them?
Thank you for the question. I don't think this bill deals directly with the exact thing that you're saying, but I do think that it will definitely help them. I think having that definition in code, I think having the awareness for teachers, I think having the additional training is going to help your son or daughter, your child. College now, well, will help the next one that comes along that may or may not be yours, but maybe the grandchild or or your neighbor's child, anything. Right. I mean, so I do think that it's going to definitely benefit them. And I'll just add, this is not a silver bullet. This is not going to solve every problem. I'm aware of that. I wished, as I said on the Senate floor, I wished we could have the perfect bill that was going to fix every problem. But it's a first step. And that's why we're having the pilot. I was having a conversation with the chairman, if you don't mind me sharing.
Which one?
The one that I believe that you would be okay with me sharing, or I wouldn't have brought it up. The pilot's there. I feel like we're probably going to need, once we run the pilot, once we've been 2 years in or even 1 year in, we're probably going to want to come back and even maybe make some adjustments. And I'm okay with that. I think that's a part of what we're doing as we try to make sure we create policy that is best suits the students and parents in Georgia and teachers.
May I, Chairman?
I was
brief.
just fixing to say, get your question down to one, because I
want to say how important this would have been for me as a parent. I actually, I just want to share this just so you just understand the impact. When he was in kindergarten, a teacher said to me, he needs a whipping, and I don't know what the problem is. The kids love him. So being able to equip teachers to be able to identify a kid with dyslexia is invaluable.
I've heard that story from others, similar type stories as well. Yes, ma'am.
So we're going to do something we talked about the other day. So everybody that thinks it's a great idea, and we think the senator's done wonderful. Raise your hand. Oh, see, that wants you to feel good, Senator Martin.
I feel
so fantastic. We don't have to tell you that we've done that.
Okay.
And committee members, do remember this will be in subcommittee on Monday, and if you have concerns also additionally beyond what you asked today, get with the senator. Get with myself, and as we try to refine this if we need to. Number 10, who is? Ms. Lopez.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Representative, for bringing this forward. I also generally I think this is a good idea. I do want to state, particularly for legislative record and for us going forward with some of the department administrators here, that I have worried in the past and just want to make this known about the over diagnoses or the over let's just say diagnosis of a lot of low income and communities of color that can, disproportionately tend to be placed in either special education or IEP programs that may not necessarily warrant those programs, and the issues really are other underlying issues. And I just wanted us to acknowledge that this is a concern we consistently see when we have some of these things, because this is not, it's harder to identify from its physiological aspect, and rather, like you said, that's why diagnosis is not exactly a proper word, because it's actually more an issue of multi-factors that you have to consider to generally get this diagnosis, again, for lack of a better word.
At some point, there is a diagnosis. That's not what we're doing
right,
here.
Right, exactly. And that's different, right? Because when you get that from a doctor, the screening and the testing that goes is far more extensive. Yeah. And so I'm always hesitant only to that regard, that we have to acknowledge that there is that bias.
Yeah, thank you, Representative, my colleague from Gwinnett. We talked about that. The bill initially did have some, we made sure that the bill says they may have characteristics of dyslexia. Not everyone that shows characteristics on a test has dyslexia. Then again, there may be students that actually pass the test that don't show the characteristics via the screening tool that do have dyslexia. It's not perfect. The good news is, if you do have a child who shows characteristics, it may be that they haven't had the exposure to reading, and that, because we're diagnosing in kindergarten. So if they come, if they come from a family where they weren't read to, maybe, or they weren't, they just haven't had the exposure, they may just be still learning the skills, and that's understood. And I think we're going to pick up on that. The tools for reaching just children who have dyslexia, they are very effective reading tools for those who don't have dyslexia either. So any extra intervention that they may get is only going to help those children to improve in their reading, and hopefully, as we all want, is to help them achieve third grade. I'm blanking, Mr. Chairman. Y'all, they can read by third grade. Yeah, literacy. So that's going to help us, even if they haven't. And we're not talking about IEPs for every kindergartner. Most of them will probably not need an IEP. They'll just need some extra help to begin understanding how to decode earlier. And the earlier we reach them, the easier it is for them to pick it up.
Yes. Representative Dickerson, I believe that's.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the great bill. I would like to ask the question, when you said that beginning on line 114, that all of the kindergarten students shall be screened for dyslexia?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what cost would this be to the local school systems? Who's going to be doing the screening? And if it's going to be a mandate on them?
Well, so, and that's why we said, on line 139, it is subject to appropriation. We don't want to create an additional burden on schools. The estimated cost of one of the screening tools that was presented in the study committee was around $8 per student. Mm-hmm. So it's a cost. It's not an insignificant cost, but it's also not a just unbearable cost. It's something I believe that we, with the state, working together with the school districts, can handle.
So can I ask another?
Yes, ma'am, please.
So will those funds come from the state to the school systems?
It's subject to appropriation, so I would say yes. In this bill, it's not an unfunded mandate.
And I'll add too, we've talked, if you know this, all kindergartners are evaluated with GKIDS. And, the cost-effective thing to do, Representative, would be to make sure that that's part of it, if it can be, that already evaluation is out there being done, and kids that move in, it's being done. So we've discussed that a little bit. How can we make sure that to hit the cost, as you're very accurately describing?
Thank you.
10 is, okay, remember, Remember, you got time to talk to him afterwards, but go ahead, ma'am.
Just wanted to follow up with that same line where it continues on 15 that says, and may screen kindergarten students for other disorders.
The other disorders is defined in the code. It's defined within the bill. We're talking about aphasia, dysgraphia, and
Well, something that I would
Dyscalculia.
want to clarify that we're speaking as to these disorders and not generally open up to all sorts of different things trying to be diagnosed or
Excuse me.
screened for. Just because it doesn't state that it's for disorders listed. For example, you're saying in the
if you look on
terminology.
line 39, other disorders means aphasia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia.
Okay. 39?
Yes, ma'am.
Not bad. All right. That's perfect.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
You can tell by your fan club behind you, it looks like you got.
And there's some excellent testimony coming, so I want to get out of the way and
Sure.
let them do it.
Well,
Thank you.
And I just will tell the speakers, like we've talked to you, please don't repeat. I mean, the committee's great. They listen. They pay attention. That goes to the people who are signed up as guests. No need to repeat the same thing over and over again as we move through. I think our committee is very attentive, and you'll find listening very good. Dr. McGivney, we sure want to hear from you. He has a handout on your desk. Which one is it? Yours? The one that says DOE. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our in-house expert is Dr. Caitlin Dooley, but she was unable to be here today, so I'm afraid you're stuck with me again. I would like to go through the handout. If you'll turn to page 2, you'll see a definition of dyslexia from the International Dyslexia Association. Actually, that's the same definition you'll find in the bill. And I'm not going to read the definition to you, but I do want to point out a couple of things in the definition. The first sentence is, dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin. I point that out because a lot of people don't realize that dyslexia is neurological. And you ask, well, why is it neurological? Without going into great detail, the brain uses 3 sections to actually allow us to learn to read and read with comprehension. Research has shown that most dyslexic children overly depend on one section of the brain. So there's no way to cure that, but there are many ways to compensate for that. There's a lot of disabilities that we learn to compensate for, and dyslexia on a scale of 1 to 10, like most disabilities, we can teach adults with dyslexia and children with dyslexia, but as younger the better as far as keeping or teaching coping skills. The other part of the definition I'd like to point out is it says these difficulties typically result from a deficit in phonological component of language. A lot of people don't associate dyslexia with language, but language is a component of dyslexia, and dyslexia is a component of language. So some of the early manifestations of dyslexia could be in language. And that's one of those things that a teacher may say with a student, Gary seems to be pretty bright and very creative, but there's something I just can't put my finger on that's not connecting with the lessons that are being taught. That can be an early sign of dyslexia associated with the language development. The other part of the definition, it makes reference to reading, comprehension as...
Can I hold my hand up and interrupt you just a minute? When you
Sure.
talk about language development, are you talking about that the parents haven't read with them enough and they've not had the words that we talk about?
Not
Is that what you're?
Not necessarily. That could
Okay.
be part of it that exacerbates the situation.
Okay.
But keep in mind, I talked about the parts of the brain that are not developed fully. That includes the language component too.
Okay, thank you.
The only other part I want to mention in the definition is reference to the reading comprehension. Many times we respond to children having reading problems as reading itself, the process of reading. And that's the time we overlook the cause of the reading. We overlook the etiology of the reading, and that's when we overlook the possibility it could be dyslexia. If you turn to page 3, just want to mention and you're familiar with this, MTSS, a multi-tiered system of support. in Georgia. As we remodeled MTSS, the focus is on identifying the needs of students with academic and or behavioral and the non-academic needs like challenges like vision and hearing. By not only looking at the student, but also looking at the classroom, the instruction, also looking at the classroom climate, also looking at the school climate, looking at the non-academic factors. In other words, the whole remodeling of MTSS is to not look at just the student as being the holder of the problem. There could be other elements that are holders of the problem or make the problem worse. So MTSS has matured to the point that we're looking far beyond what we used to look at in the past. So now is a perfect time to train teachers to start looking for indications of other disabilities such as dyslexia, which leads us to the 3 tiers of MTSS, one being Tier 1, which is the classroom. So we look for the effectiveness of instruction. We look for the foundation of the classroom, because if you have a disability like dyslexia on a scale of 1 to 10, there can be changes in the classroom that could actually help the student cope with the dyslexia in the classroom without them having to be removed. Now, if that doesn't work, then MTSS we have Tier 2, which is individual intervention. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean the student has to leave the classroom and be pulled out of the classroom and go to an individual area for support. It can be still the teacher doing differentiation instruction in the classroom, meeting the needs of that student. And then Tier 3 would be a student who's been referred for perhaps placement in a special education program or a 504 plan or some other kind of accommodation plan. So hopefully we try to, as it was mentioned earlier, we try not to over-identify for special education placement, and that's the value and that's the purpose, and that was the impetus behind remodeling MTSS, so we can address individual student needs without referring everybody to special education is the only way to receive services. On page 4 is a simple acknowledgement, Mr. Chair and other members of the committee, that we cannot do this alone. If we're going to get into the prevention, intervention, and world, we also have to get into the collaboration world. So we have reached out to other entities like Get Georgia Reading Campaign. They've done an enormous amount of research, really brought to light to a lot of us the relationship between dyslexia and language acquisition, and how dyslexia is on a scale of 1 to 10, and there are things that we can do to help children on that full spectrum learn to cope with their disability. We also learn from the volunteer world that there are a lot of non-academic elements that can make dyslexia and other disabilities more profound, like undiagnosed vision problem, overlooked hearing problem. Asthma is the #1 health reason why students miss school. So if you have a student who has dyslexia and asthma, then it's not likely they're going to be successful in school without a lot of help. And heretofore, I'm afraid we've missed some of those situations where students had more than one challenge to overcome. So what I'm saying to you is we can do better, and we're going to do better. Also, we have collaboration with Georgia Professional Standards, as you heard earlier from Senator Martin about the endorsement. We've already talked to them about some of the people who can be working on that endorsement. And of course, we continue to work with USG on teacher preparation and teacher awareness of disabilities like a particular dyslexia. On page 5, just want to mention the Literacy for Georgia grant. The DOE offers competitive grants to school systems focused on using data to determine if students are in a tiered need, so that we can focus on the impact, for example, of early language. The early language skills necessary to support reading development. We have several school systems that are using their grants for that. We have some school systems that, for example, convene a network of special education, speech and language, and dyslexia experts to identify needs and develop resources, and to make sure the resources are shared throughout the school systems at all grade levels. And another use of the grant is supporting professional learning for current teachers and leaders regarding foundational reading skills. What is reading? What impacts reading? What are some of the early diagnosis of reading problems, such as dyslexia? So part of this, a major part of this, is education. On page 6, we've already started at the DOE creating a resource guide for school systems around dyslexia. Actually, we are engaging experts and parents and school systems and advocates to develop a resource guide, as I said, for schools and school systems. And some of the topics, this is not all inclusive, of course, would be defining and describing dyslexia, the neuroscience of dyslexia, what to look for with dyslexia, dyslexia as a language learning disability, social-emotional factors of dyslexia, effective approaches for teaching students with dyslexia, and sharing information with parents and guardians about dyslexia. The timeline, Mr. Chairman, other members of the committee, for that resource guide to be available is, we hope to have it ready by early July.
And Dr. McGivney, in that resource guide, would it include, like, I know in the last is information for parents and guardians. Would it include, like, you know, how parents, or is that a whole nother part, how a parent of a student with dyslexia could help them, or is that something totally different?
What we found to be effective, Mr. Chairman, in that section, regardless of what the topic is, to have a question and answer section. That would be, the preamble would be, if your child is diagnosed with dyslexia, or if your child has the following difficulties, what do I do as a parent? So it include questions and answers related to that, of what they should do, very practical. What should I do next? What are questions I should ask the school system? What are questions I should ask the teachers? What resources may be available in my community? How to access those resources and things like that.
We've got a question from Ms. Representative Stovall.
Hello. We don't really give recommendations for the literacy grant. There are some parameters because it's a federal grant that they have to fall within. As long as it's related to literacy and improving literacy outcomes, and most of those grants have been approved. But what we've seen and what I tried to highlight here is that some of those grants, the local school systems have focused on dyslexia and other related, language-related challenges for students.
Okay, thank you.
And I encourage committee members, if you have questions after you think about it, please contact Dr. McGivney. He's very easy to get a hold of, and surely can answer those questions for us. But I appreciate you. Next we have Samantha Durrance, a policy analyst from SREB. And I think you have handouts too, right?
Yes, I did. You should all have a copy there. And there's a printed copy that's the actual presentation. There's also a copy of our dyslexia brief and a one-pager that covers
So if you would
that.
just kind of tell us who you are and who you represent. I mean, we kind of know, but maybe folks out there don't.
Sure. My name is Samantha Durrance. I'm a policy analyst with the Southern Regional Education Board. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit institution that was formed by a charter of 16 southeastern states, from Texas up to Delaware. So my maps and some of the things that I have in here today will focus on that southeastern region. What I want to do is provide you with a little bit of an overview of what has been going on in our region with regard to dyslexia policy and some other things that you need to know about dyslexia in order to make an informed decision today. And some dyslexia basics that really we should start off with. Dr. McGivney covered this a little bit, but you'll see that there's an image of two different brains. And if you want to boil it down, dyslexia is at its core kind of a difference in how the brain processes the sounds of language and how it relates those to written symbols. And so that is also the core of reading and writing and spelling. And that's what makes dyslexia a big learning problem for children who have it when they get to school. So if you really want to kind of boil it down to that core, that's what it is and why it's an issue for children. It's also important to know that it's not really a medical condition. Although it's based in the brain, it can't be cured. There's no drug to treat it. And medical doctors generally will not diagnose it. Your pediatrician is not equipped to make a diagnosis of dyslexia. The way to get a diagnosis is to, for most people, pay $1,000 or $2,000 and get an evaluation from a psychologist, which involves a lot of testing. And that's not feasible for many families, which is why, in part, dyslexia kind of falls to the school system. It's not a medical issue, it's a learning issue. And it's addressed very minimally by existing policy, federal policy or state policy. At the federal level, it falls under the category of a specific learning disability. That's according to the IDEA, Special Education Law, but there are some challenges there. One of the challenges, as was mentioned before, is that even if you go get an evaluation through the school from a school psychologist there, sometimes they won't call it dyslexia. They'll usually call it a phonological processing deficit. And that does not necessarily allow schools to know what it is they're supposed to provide to students, as well as if they knew that child has dyslexia, because we do know what instruction works for kids with dyslexia. Some children with dyslexia also will not qualify for special education. They may need support, they may have difficulties, but they may not be struggling to the extent that they'll qualify for an IEP. And with the right instruction and early support, many children don't need an IEP in order to cope with dyslexia. If all children were being taught to read in a research-based manner, and if children who still struggled got the intervention that they needed in a research-based manner, many children with dyslexia would not need anything beyond that, because they would be taught the skills that they need through that instruction and intervention. At least 1 in 10 and as many as 20% of students are thought to be affected by dyslexia. It depends on who you ask and how they did the research study, but those are pretty big numbers. So in Georgia, that's about 190,000 to 380,000 K through 12 students. In order to identify those students and get them the help they need, a lot of states are recognizing that screening has a role to play there. And screening doesn't always mean screening for dyslexia. In fact, screening in general is screening for reading problems. There's a pattern of reading problems that can be characteristic of dyslexia, but all screeners are looking at reading skills. There are currently 10 states in our 16-state region that screen either for foundational reading skills and or dyslexia. Some do both. You can see that Georgia is currently among 6 states that has not passed any policies to mandate screening. That doesn't mean that there's not other types of assessment that happens in schools, but those types of assessment are different from the type of screening that we're talking about, and I'll tell you a little bit why that is. Screening basics involve knowing what screening can and cannot do and what it is and what it isn't. Screening should be quick. It provides a snapshot of a student's skills at a given point in time, and it should occur more than once per year because it provides a snapshot. And if you have students who aren't struggling in the fall, that doesn't mean they won't be struggling in the spring. That's actually part of a good RTI or MTSS process, is screening more than once per year. A screener can group students into 2 categories, at risk in reading and not at risk. That's what it does. It can't identify dyslexia, it can't diagnose dyslexia, it just tells you which students are more likely to struggle with reading later on. And screening at its core is really a tool. It's not a solution. So what matters just as much as the screening is what happens afterward. It's a tool to identify students who need help. A research-based model for screening acknowledges that screening alone cannot identify students who are going to struggle with reading. What tends to happen, as you see on a chart on your next page, is that a screening tool, depending on the school that it's being used in, may identify a large percentage of students as being at risk for reading difficulties, especially if you're screening very early, like in kindergarten. If you have students who are coming to school without language skills, without reading skills, we have students who come to school not knowing letters, numbers, sounds, colors even. And those students are going to be considered at risk by most screening tools. Many of them, with instruction and intervention, will go on to be okay in reading, but some of them won't. And so the next step would be to provide good instruction and intervention to students and see which ones don't make some progress. This doesn't have to take a whole year. It doesn't even have to take months per se. But there will be students who make very quick progress with good instruction, and there will be students who don't. And of students who don't, those students could be examined for signs of dyslexia, such as a family history, certain language difficulties that they display, a pattern of skills that you see on the results of the screener. And out of those students, that's how a school team could look at all of the data together and say, okay, based on the screening results, based on the fact that the student hasn't made progress and we know they've had good instruction and intervention, and based on the signs that we're seeing, we think this is a student who may have dyslexia or they have characteristics of dyslexia. And once you make that determination, we know what those students need in order to learn to read. This model is currently used in states like Alabama and Arkansas. So it is a multi-step model, but it does kind of get around the issue of over-identifying students who are at risk, especially when you're talking about the earliest grades. There are some best practices when it comes to screening. And the first is that a screener should assess grade level skills that predict reading performance. There are certain skills in different grades that are more predictive of later reading ability. And so in kindergarten, that's about 3 or 4 different skills. First grade, 2 different skills, and second grade and up, 2 skills. A lot of states that require screening require 5 or 6 different skills to be in that screener. It's probably not necessary for all of those to be there. These are the skills that, based on multiple research studies, seem to be kind of the most predictive of later reading ability. So screening students for 2 or 3 skills could be as effective as screening for 5 or 6, if they're the right skills. A screening tool should be reliable, valid, and accurate. That means that it should do what it says it's supposed to do. It should accurately categorize students as much as possible. And it should use objective measures, not subjective judgment. In the study committee, a question was brought up previously about GKIDS being used as a potential screening tool. And there's another form of dyslexia screener that is a similar rating scale. The issue with GKIDS is that it doesn't give you an objective measure. And it gives you a measure of whether, according to a teacher's observation, a student is developing a skill or has not developed a skill or is exceeding at a skill. It's also hard to tell whether a student has made progress if there's not a way to differentiate between whether they've just started developing it or maybe they've developed it a little bit more. That would not be considered a good screening tool for reading. A screening tool should be given more than once per year, as said before, so that you catch students who weren't struggling earlier on. And it should be efficient. It should be quick and inexpensive, because especially if you're talking about screening all students, it takes a lot of time and that can add up. So it should be something that can be used by your average classroom teacher and can be used in 5, 10, 15 minutes max. There is a balanced decision that needs to be made in terms of the timing of screening. There are benefits to screening earlier on, like in kindergarten, which is that you can provide intervention more quickly to students who need it. When you provide intervention earlier, it's easier, it's less expensive, and it's more effective. However, you're going to get more false positives if you screen earlier on. So there will be more students who are identified as at risk who perhaps wouldn't have gone on to have difficulties. But as has been said today, those students are not going to they're going to benefit as well from the intervention, just like students who really, truly are at risk. There's not really much of a downside to providing extra support to a student, except that for schools, it comes down to a question of how many students you're having to support. If you screen later, such as in first grade, you can get more accurate identification of students because they've been in school longer. You can truly see, okay, this student has been struggling for 6 months. They're still not making much progress, and we see this pattern of strengths and weaknesses and skills. So it makes it easier to really identify which students would benefit the most from intervention. But intervention is more expensive and it's less effective the later you do it. And research shows that if you wait till second grade or later, the chances of a child catching up to grade level are fairly low. So really getting intervention by the end of first grade is ideal. We put together some cost estimates, both for the study committee and here for screening all K through 2 students. If that's an example, there were some states screen in each grade. In a small county like Macon County, the cheapest screener that I know of costs $1 per student. So that screener would cost about $300 per year to administer to all K through 2 students in Macon County. A more expensive tool, as the one Senator Picard mentioned earlier, or Senator Martin, I'm sorry, would cost a little over $2,000 per student. That's about $8 per student. In a mid-sized district like Floyd County with about 2,000 K through 2 students, the cheaper screener would cost about $2,000 a year, and the more expensive one would cost a little over $16,000. And in the biggest county in the district, which is Gwinnett County, the cheapest screener would cost about $37,000, and the most expensive about $300,000. So there are different options for different types of screeners. There are a lot of valid screeners out there, and that's a decision that could be made based on what the district is able to do in a lot of cases. Many states present a list of approved screeners and let the district choose, so they can choose one that's more feasible for them. When it comes to screening, the last thing to remember is that screening is not the same thing as intervention, so screening is not the end. What really matters after screening is what you do about those students who are at risk for reading. And what we know about students with dyslexia and what they need from intervention is that it's more specific content than most teachers are currently prepared to give. That's where teachers training comes in, and that's where teachers may need specialized training to provide that type of intervention. You can see that there are a lot of different elements of what that ideal content might consist of. These students really need to be taught the elements of the English language and how it works more explicitly than other students would need to be. And that instruction looks a little bit different than what we may be used to. It involves really learning the rules of the English language and how it works together. And again, these are things that teachers are not generally prepared to do, so it would be something that would require training. There is no one specific program that any state says districts must use to provide that kind of intervention. The gold standard you've probably heard of is Orton-Gillingham, but there are also other main programs that are based on that. Wilson, Barton, Linda Midvale. There are proprietary programs that are based on those main programs, and then there are additional commercial programs. So there are lots of options out there at different price levels. They do all cost money, and many of them require training to administer. When it comes to training, though, we also had identified for the study committee and would like to talk to you today about an option that is already out there for how the state, if it chose to, could help districts provide for training, for intervention, even for screening. If you're familiar with Georgia's Early Intervention Program, or EIP, it's a program that's designed for at-risk students in K through 5, specifically really for reading and math. So this program is oriented to provide districts extra money to help students who are struggling with reading and math, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about struggling readers in general, including many students with dyslexia. Students who are eligible for the school to receive extra funds for intervention, that decision is made based on a rubric that's provided by GOSA, and that rubric is something that could be updated or changed. There's no reason that it couldn't be made to include students who are at risk on the universal screener or at risk on any form of other screener or assessment. That is something that would be an option. Those funds can be used by schools to provide intervention, and really they're oriented at reducing class size so that intervention is hopefully more, and instruction is hopefully more effective for students. But there's also no reason that if the state chose, those funds couldn't be designated for structured literacy intervention programs or dyslexia-specific intervention for students who need it. And we're talking about a really large pot of funds. The last number I saw for fiscal year 2019 was over $600 million. So these are already appropriated funds every year that districts have access to. They designate students who qualify for the use of these funds, and then they can provide services however they see fit using those funds. So that's an option that is out there that would not require additional money to be appropriated. And the last thing I want to briefly cover today is teacher preparation and training. We've heard a story from a representative today about her child and how she was told that dyslexia was not something that could be put in his IEP, and I just want to say that's explicitly wrong. Federal law explicitly says that schools can and should use the word dyslexia if it applies. And that misunderstanding is fairly common among schools from what I understand. That's one part of what training for teachers should address, is those misunderstandings that really keep us from doing the best we can for students. Teacher preparation and training should also make sure that teachers know what to look for if they're looking for students with signs of dyslexia. So there are certain signs that are common at a given age. Doesn't mean every child with dyslexia has them, but they're fairly common. And teachers should be familiar with whatever state process may be established to identify students with dyslexia or to use MTSS or RTI to address that. And they should also be made familiar with instructional strategies that can help these students, because as has also been mentioned today, there are a lot of instructional strategies that can be used in the classroom for all students that are beneficial to all students, but are also necessary for students with dyslexia. And some school districts in our state are already experimenting with those kinds of instruction. I know Marietta City Schools is a district that district-wide is implementing some of those. There are some schools in APS that are trying it as well. And training should address misconceptions like what we've heard before, including that educators cannot diagnose or identify dyslexia, that dyslexia can't be identified until a child is far behind in reading, and that all students with dyslexia need special education. If these misunderstandings are common, then we're fighting an uphill battle in terms of getting these kids recognized and getting them the help they need. There are currently 8 states in our 16-state region that require training for current teachers. That's training on identifying dyslexia and specific teaching methods for it. And I have some details about what some of those states do for that training here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to let you kind of read that in your own time. There are also 4 states that require training for pre-service early grades teachers. And like training for current teachers, this really consists of training teachers in terms of what to look for and how to use intervention in the classroom, how to use teaching methods that work for all students and are necessary for students with dyslexia. The last thing that we should probably as a state pay attention to if we're talking about teacher preparation and training is the issue of reading in general. Dyslexia is very intimately connected with reading, and as I said before, if every child were taught to read using research-based methods, we wouldn't have as many children struggling with reading or with dyslexia in the state. What we know works for reading is direct, explicit instruction in the essential components of reading, systematic phonics instruction, which means teaching those relationships in a logical sequence systematically to all children, and building vocabulary and teaching young children strong decoding skills. Some of the methods that are used to teach reading in schools today don't focus as much on sounding out the letters and identifying words as they do on teaching children to use context and pictures and whatever else is going on in the story to guess at words they don't know. And that is not effective for teaching children to read. It's especially not effective for kids with dyslexia. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Oops, sorry. Okay, number 26 was first. Who is that? Chairman Nix.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. One of the things you mentioned caught my attention. You mentioned it as part of an RTI screening. Is that common that it's part of a response to intervention when you have a child that maybe has had problems and they get into that program? Is that a common thing to do?
It varies by state. Some states do have dyslexia-specific screening, so they may screen all students for dyslexia, like Mississippi screens students at the end of kindergarten and in the fall of first grade. And that kind of shortcuts the RTI process for any child who needs that assistance and needs that intervention. Other states have chosen to do that process through RTI or MTSS because they have a system in place. But the goal is really, if you're going to do that, then the state focuses on making sure that you're using first that universal screening for reading, and then any students who are at risk on that screening should receive a follow-up screening that looks for dyslexia. So you're taking, one pool of students, all students, cutting it down to a smaller pool, and then taking that pool and trying to really tease out which of those students may be struggling because they have dyslexia.
Okay. Can I follow up, please?
Yes, sir, please.
In that thought, with that thought in mind, would this possibly be a place that I think Representative Carter mentioned how can we help the students in the program now? I would assume quite a number of them would end up in RTI, and maybe we could put it there almost as a pilot to see how it works with those students who may be struggling that we've already identified, even if we can't screen everybody, but make it part of that screening.
Again, that is a process used in some states. The challenge with RTI is always implementation. There's a lot of research showing that many schools struggle with actually implementing RTI and identifying students who need to be in that RTI process at the higher tiers. And so if that's not happening effectively in a school, then there will be additional challenges if you're also trying to identify students with dyslexia through that process.
Okay, thank you.
24, is that Chairman Belton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing this very important bill up. We try very hard in this committee not to create more things for teachers to have to do. So how much classroom time is this going to take to do a typical kindergarten class? How much time would the kindergarten teacher lose doing all this grading?
If you have a kindergarten class with, say, 20 students and you have a screening tool that takes 5 minutes apiece, then that's 100 minutes. That's a little over an hour and a half. And if you're doing that tool twice a year, say, it's a little over 3 hours a year to do that screening. I think it is important to point out, though, too, that in states that have implemented these types of policies, the screening is, in most cases, replacing other types of assessment that are already happening. So schools already generally are monitoring students' reading progress through other methods. These are informal assessments, and some of them that are common are things like running records, which is where a teacher sits with a student while they read a story and marks the errors that they make and the types of errors, and gets a measure of their reading level and how accurate they are. But that form of assessment wouldn't really qualify as a screening under what research shows because it's not objective. It is subjective based on the text that the child is reading, what the teacher says that their comprehension is, and it's hard to tell whether a student's making progress or not from one to another. And so if that's what a school is using, and instead the state were to say, for example, we would like you to screen students 3 times a year using one of these tools, the district could instead use those tools rather than also doing that and what they're already doing. So it's possible that it could, instead of supplementing what they're already doing in forms of assessment, substitute for it.
Just follow up there on Chairman Belton's question. I think you said at some point toward the end of your talk, one was 15 minutes long, an assessment. Is that, did I hear something wrong?
They vary. There are assessments that take 10 to 15 minutes. There are some that claim to be a little shorter. It really depends on the particular assessment.
Okay. Representative Carter.
Thank you, Chairman. So my question, in states who have implemented screening and they've identified that there's some of the students actually have dyslexia and there are interventions in place, are they seeing fewer students who are not reading proficiently by third, and is it reducing their special education population?
These laws in most states are fairly new, so we don't really have a whole lot of data yet on how that's impacting, especially students in 3rd grade and later, because in most states they haven't gotten to 3rd grade yet.
Gotcha.
If you've started this in kindergarten. There is a study in Ohio which had a pilot program for dyslexia screening and intervention, and their evaluation did look at the numbers of students qualifying for special education, and they thought it was having a small impact on those percentages. Theoretically, it should. We just don't have the data on it right now to really show that. But I will say that what you tend to see in states, and I've spoken specifically with a leader in Arkansas, she told me that what their dyslexia policies have pointed out is that they have a reading instruction problem. They have districts where upwards of 60% of children are failing the dyslexia screener because they're not being taught to read effectively. So they've actually used that data to go back and work on reading across the state in addition to trying to identify students with dyslexia.
Thank you.
Just to follow, just as you mentioned earlier, So just 2 systems in our state are doing, as you identified, doing testing at this moment. They said Marietta City and APS.
I have
So-
heard of those 2 systems that
Okay.
are taking steps to implement instruction in the classroom,
Okay.
in all classrooms, that benefit students with dyslexia. That is this type of structured multisensory instruction that students with dyslexia need.
Not so much the
Not screening,
gotcha.
no,
Okay.
it's intervention and instruction.
Vice Chairman Chokus gets a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got 2 questions, and the first one is, could you please give us some general examples of specific teaching methods so that we can get through the students that have dyslexia?
So what we know works for students with dyslexia is because there is that difference in the brain pathways, because there is a weaker pathway between sounds and seeing letters, you have to kind of call on other brain pathways to teach a child that connection. And so Orton-Gillingham instruction, for example, kind of the gold standard for intervention for students with dyslexia, uses a lot of multisensory methods. Rather than just looking at letters and hearing sounds or saying sounds, students are writing them in the sand. They're writing the letters in the air. They're focusing on the shapes that their mouths make when they say the sounds of the letters. And so you're using a lot of other brain pathways to try and shore up the ones that aren't working as well for those children.
Perfect. The second question that I have is, have you done any research, or is there any data on children growing up in multilingual households?
I have not personally. I do know that the methods that are effective for students with dyslexia are also known to be effective for English language learners. Because you are teaching a child the structure of the language in a much more systematic way than would normally happen, it tends to help them learn English more quickly and more easily as well.
Well, I wasn't necessarily thinking about learning English. I was thinking where you had parents that spoke English and another language in the home.
I mean, I think that would probably be the same thing, that you have a student who may speak both languages in the home or may speak one and then come to school and speak another. Teaching them the English language more systematically and in a structured manner is still going to help them pick up the language and pick up reading skills more effectively.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Carter.
You just happened to hit one that like came home. So I mean, what you're sharing is so important. And I think like 12 years ago, wish I had this. So what for us, and I think it's important for the community to understand as a parent, it is expensive to find support. So we were introduced to Linda Mood Bell, which is really expensive. And a lot of parents can't necessarily afford to do that, and you have to literally take your kids out of school. Then we went, Kumon, I was thinking Representative Chokus, Kumon was one that we used, and that was a originally English-speaking family that created because their kid was having a problem. So I just think there's some out there. But I guess what I'm getting at, if this is something that we could do in our school system, in our public schools, and we find it early. I know personally, if we had this help earlier, then my son would not have struggled, but he had me fighting along the way. And a lot of parents, you don't have that, and some parents, even with all we did have, we didn't have enough knowledge, right, to really understand what we were doing. But if we could do it early, then we would have students reading earlier, which would solve the reading proficiency by 3rd grade. And just from our experience, reduce the amount of time that kids are going to be in special education. They're in class, which potentially could increase graduation rates, which I think is ultimately what we're trying to do. So I think what you're doing is so important. I don't necessarily have a question. I just think it's so important. Like, I guess, what do we need to do? Because I can just see how students who are undiagnosed could end up dropping out or struggling when if they had to help earlier, we could be a little further along.
I'll answer that question for Representative. If we pass this bill, I think we'll do what you said. Yeah, I think that's what has been the essence of it for sure. Thank you. Ma'am, also, we don't have your contact information.
I'll make sure and get that to you.
Okay, so I can give it to the committee as they ask, you know, if a question comes up, so they can get with you. And with other questions that will come up, as always do.
May I say one last thing?
Oh, please. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's important to remember that really, as you just said, the end goal is getting more children reading. We know that there's a problem with the percentage of children who are reading proficiently by 3rd grade and graduating from high school and being prepared to enter the workforce. These are not students who we are suddenly making up. They're already students who are in the schools. In most cases, they're already struggling with reading. And so what states that have already passed dyslexia policies are really trying to do is more specifically identify those students and get them what it is they need so that that group can be more successful and by proxy help other students who could benefit from that as well. So I think that's one important thing to remember is that the end goal is helping all struggling readers and all struggling readers will benefit from policies that identify them and get them extra support.
Here, here. Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Tina Enberg, Decoding Dyslexia Georgia. So like I said, please, yes, ma'am, certainly is. Just make sure that we don't repeat the same thing. You'll lose your group if you do. I'm just warning you.
I struck out some sections.
There you go.
Let me get my old lady glasses on. Good afternoon, Chairman Jaspers and the representatives of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to come speak about Senate Bill 48, and thank you for all that you do for education in our state. May I begin with something that I believe and hope we all agree upon. I believe we can all agree that it is absolutely essential that all students in Georgia learn how to read. Yes? That without the ability to read, many opportunities from educational options to future workforce opportunities are lost. I am here in my capacity as a state leader of Decoding Dyslexia Georgia. We are a grassroots parent-led network. We represent several thousand families with dyslexic students across the state. Here are a couple facts about dyslexia. It is the most common learning disability. It ranges from mild to very severe. Without intervention, many dyslexic students will not learn how to read. The earlier the intervention, the greater chance for reading success. I ask that you support Senate Bill 48. It addressed several key points, including mandated screening using a qualified screening tool. Screening is just a first step and points school districts in the direction of finding ways to reach students more effectively. Georgia already screens students for vision and hearing so that students, the school, and parents are already alerted to any red flags. By no means does a hearing screening deem a child deaf or vision screening provide the prescription necessary for eyeglasses, but it is a valuable tool to provide important information for a student to get the most out of their education. The urgency for screening in kindergarten is not a new concept. Screening is, quote, screening is neither a comprehensive nor a complete process and does not, in and of itself, constitute the diagnostic process. The goal is not to refer at-risk children to special education, but to more effectively address their specific deficits earlier in the general education setting, thereby improving overall outcomes. Badian, 2000. Here's what usually happens. Intervention does not take place until students fail. When a student comes through elementary and is evaluated at the end of 3rd grade using the milestones for right now, that test represents 4 years of reading instruction. For a student to have 2/3 of their elementary career done, only to realize they're a beginning learner or developing learner is simply too late, and for far too many students. Identification of dyslexia in the 4th grade takes 4 times as long to intervene as it would for a late kindergarten-age student because of the nature of brain development. Quote, in 4th grade, students need 2 hours of instructional time to make the same gains as made in 30 minutes of instructional time in kindergarten. Joseph Torgeson, 2004 to 2007. That delay in identification cost school districts large amounts of money. I referred to the Ohio dyslexia pilot study. Identifying dyslexics early in their education will help avoid so many issues. Dyslexics, being the creative kids that they are, do what they can to give the appearance that they're reading. They want to please their teachers. They resort to guessing, not reading, not decoding. This gives the appearance that they're reading when they're simply demonstrating an ability to memorize. As a result, these kids are not identified until 4th, 5th, 6th, and even 7th grade, if at all. At that point, they do not know how to read with their peer group, and they can no longer keep up. They work so much harder than typical students do, and as Dr. Sally Shaywitz says, dyslexia robs a student of time. The provision for notifying parents if their child is flagged by the screener is a critical element in this bill. Like a parent going to the pediatrician and describing symptoms to the doctor for a clear understanding of what is going on, so too does parental notification and feedback from the school play a vital role. If it were the doctor, would you not want to hear the results? If students aren't identified, which is a tragic reality for a huge number of students, their frustration leads directly to a multiplier effect on dropping out of high school, 3 times as likely. That's from a statistic from the National Centers for Learning Disabilities. There is no coincidence that a high percentage of prisoners are found to be dyslexic, something the U.S. Senate recently moved to address in its recent Prison Reform Act. Dyslexia, for those identified, we know the path towards success is using structured literacy and the support that a base of knowledge about dyslexia provides. Early identification is the key for a dyslexic student to be successful in school. Once a student is identified, then the student can receive the help they need to learn how to read. Without it, not only can the student not receive the help they need, but the child then feels inadequate, not smart, and even stupid. Identifying dyslexia allows the child to know and understand why they're different. Without identification, you're setting up dyslexic students in school systems for failure. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you.
Oops. Thank you, ma'am, for speaking. Are you saying amen?
No, I didn't. I was clearing my throat.
Oh, okay. I thought you wanted to say amen.
We are both fully
Okay.
pollinated.
Ms. Becky? Ms. Becky, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, so how long has your organization been around?
So Decoding Dyslexia is a national grassroots organization that took place, it got started 7 years ago. A group of parents took a train from New Jersey to a conference on structured literacy in New York, and they all looked around that car and decided they needed to do something. So our Georgia outpost has been in force for 6 years now, and I believe we just had our 6th Dyslexia Day at the Capitol. So we've been here raising awareness.
Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
good work. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Well, thank you very much for what you've been doing for 7 years.
Thank you.
Okay, now next we have the Swift School. Meredith's got a little demonstration for us. And community members, I think you'll enjoy this. I wish everybody was here to see this, but we'll let them get on with it. If you want somebody talk while somebody passes out, because we need to, because I'm going to, this meeting adjourns at 3 o'clock, and so if you're burning other people's time, you're burning other people's time.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Meredith Weaver. This is more of a personal thing for me. I have a dyslexic child, and he's been attending the Swift School. Very fortunate to be able to go there, and it's been absolutely fantastic for us to be able to do this. But this is Rich Winlick and 2 of his colleagues who are, we thought it would be fun for you all to kind of see some things and have a little exercise of simulation, if you will. I've been through this as a parent, so it just gave me a different perspective of kind of how.
To be dyslexic.
Exactly. Right.
The dyslexic simulations are.
Hang on, now, you gotta be by the microphone, over there.
I don't have much to say.
Okay, that's great.
Okay.
Because all these other people are saying, I want to talk.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Rich Winlick. I head the Swift School. And you have Joan Gherkin and Natalie Felix. They are Orton Gillingham Fellows with extensive training in in multisensory instruction and in Orton Gillingham practice. And what you're going to experience is called a simulation, and you will you will view the materials you're interacting with as a dyslexic would view them. The first, and I'm going to turn it over to Joni and to Natalie at this time to explain to you what you're going to be doing.
Okay, we are going to start with a reading activity. So I know sometimes in schools, if something's difficult for you, you try to hide or not get called on. Since we have a couple of members who have left, I think each of you will have an opportunity to read. So you have a reader in front of you, and what I'm going to ask you to do is to not look forward and try to stay on the page of what we're reading. I'll try to give everyone an opportunity to read orally. I will tell you, as you open up to the first page, go ahead and do that, please. You see pictures, and you see a picture of a wizard, some elves, and some books. If you look down below the pictures, you see the new spelling representation for those particular words. What you're going to find as we go through this book is that once they've introduced a word to you, which is a lot of the experiences that our kids have with reading, they're not going to tell you what that word is again on the next page. So you're going to have to rely on your visual processing system and memory to hold on to what those words were. So what I'm going to ask is that we're just going to start right here in the back row with this gentleman who looks like he's eager to start us off reading. That would be you, sir. And if you will turn to page 2, could you please read from page 2 for us? I would like for you to read what we're reading, please. Well, the first word they give you, it's in parentheses behind it. Do you see R?
Are you in all these?
That was a word from the first page. Can anybody help him out?
Books.
Books, okay.
Books, you. I'm afraid I can't read the rest of it.
Okay. Look right up above in that first line, and that was the word they just showed you. You. Okay, you want to help him out?
There's elves.
Elves, okay. So we'll let your friend who was helping you out so much read page 3, okay? So everybody turn to page 3.
We are busy, thank you, wizard. No, we are busy,
Well, they were busy.
we're in all these books in all these
Books.
yeah, books. Yeah.
Okay, okay. All right, so if you'll pick up page 4. And why don't you just read the first sentence in page 4?
Do you like all these books?
Yes. Do you like all these books? Okay. The lady sitting next to you? You're just not participating? Oh, yeah. Okay. Mr. Chairman?
Well, staff, you can help me then. do you like being what? Do you like being in them all? This is from Help. I couldn't read it.
That's quite all right. You know, sometimes we need a friend to kind of help us out. So sometimes kids in the classroom like that because they have somebody helping them. And then there's some children who like to figure it out for themselves. So building self-esteem is being all about being able to figure out something that's difficult and doing it on your own. So we're going to move all the way down to the next lady. If you were on page 5.
Let's kind of move quick now because these people
We
behind
are.
you want to talk.
We are.
Okay.
Okay. You want me to just have her read one more page? Okay. Okay. Let's read it. Did anybody read it? Volunteers? Okay, I'll stop there. If I were to ask you comprehension questions now, this is where we would really struggle because all of our effort was going to decoding and sounding out words and trying to remember some of the word patterns that we saw on the previous page. So it kind of gives you that feeling or that struggle that you have. I think, are you going to do your mirror activity?
Mr. Chairman, would you like me to do the second activity? Okay, so we'll do it really quick. You should already have handed out a mirror, a piece of, a little packet that has, it's stapled together, has a star on it, and you should have a piece of construction paper. Do you all see that? Okay, yes, okay. So I'm going to explain to you the activity. This is going to be a writing activity now as opposed to a reading activity. This is a visual motor test. On the star activity sheet, you should see 2 stars, one inside the other. You must draw a line between the border lines of these 2 stars. Be sure to follow the lines all around the stars. Keep the hand you are using to write covered with the construction paper at all times. That's your cover board. And so you're going to only look at the mirror to guide your writing hand. So try and position your writing hand and the mirror, and you're going to cover with the cover your hand. And so you can only see in the mirror. Okay? Are you all in a good spot now? Okay. So you can go ahead and draw a line inside of the 2 stars. And if you go outside the star, I'm afraid you're going to have to start over. So by the way, boys and girls, we are going to be going out for recess as soon as you're done this activity correctly.
So this is really kind of showing the difficulty that students have with writing. So something that's automatic for us in being able to write letters or names and words, their struggle is not only sometimes with the sounds and spelling, but it's the actual writing itself that's challenging. Okay? Thank you very much.
That writing component is kind of that highest form of language. So the fact that you are struggling at this point is not surprising, okay? Not surprising.
Question?
Look, they want to get it done.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay.
Opportunity to be dyslexic for a very brief period of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for what you do for helping kids. Okay, we'll be using the podium mic. That one's there if you can. So how much time we got? About 2 minutes each? So we've got a couple of minutes for each person. I know that doesn't seem like long, but at 3 o'clock, these people will leave because they've got to go all over Georgia to get home. And since we've been here since Sunday, most of us. So, pardon? Be about 2 minutes. So first we have down is Jenna Benedict. And then after her, and what we'll do, I'll call the next one up so that can kind of be getting in line over there, would be, is it Bryn Hayes? You want to do this? Okay, go ahead. Just be getting in line.
Hi, I'm Jenna Benedict. I'm a junior in high school. I was diagnosed with dyslexia when at the end of 3rd grade after I failed my CRCTs, which are the Georgia milestones now, twice. People didn't really realize that I was dyslexic until after that. I would memorize all of my reading passages, and instead of saying mother, I would say mom. So that's what I got away with. So when I was going into 4th grade, my mom decided that she wanted to pick my teacher to make sure I was getting the right education I needed. So she went through all the teachers and found the best teacher. But when I would take my test, I'd stay up studying with my parents all night. I'd know the information forward and backwards. I'd still get the test back, and they would be fails. And there was no reason for them to be fails because I knew the information. My mom went to my teacher and asked, what's going on with Jenna? She knows this information. I know she knows the information. We went over it 1,000 times. And my teacher, I had an IEP that said, someone has to read my test to me because I can't read, but I know the information if it's read to me. My teacher said, it only said someone had to read the test to me. She wouldn't read the test to me. She would have a student pull me in the hall and read the test to me. And the student was the social butterfly of the class whose friends always walked outside to go to the bathroom, but just to socialize. And I was known as the stupid kid who didn't know how to read because the other kids in my class had to read for me. So when my mom found that out, she said, I'm not going to school until I moved out of that class. And I was moved out of the class and put in with a great teacher after that, who I'm still friends with today, and she was my tutor throughout the years. And I went from being the stupidest kid in that class and moving to my new class to the smartest kid. So it's very important that we educate our teachers how to teach a dyslexic and not to take the easy way out.
Hear, hear. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. I think if you had been at our first committee meeting that we had this year, we all went around the room and talked about a teacher that made a great impact on our lives. And I believe that one made one on you, didn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so then we're going to hear Miss Hayes, then Miss Audrey Jane Leftwich. We'll be up next after this young lady.
Hello, my name is Bryn Haynes and I am 9 years old. I am dyslexic. I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was in 1st grade. I was very lucky to get diagnosed that early. Some kids get diagnosed in 4th grade, sometimes later or never. That's a long time to struggle. Before I was diagnosed, I would go to do my homework and I would always start off in a good mood, but I would end up in tears. I was so frustrated that I fought with my mom when she tried to help me. It was really hard for my family because they did not know what was wrong. My mom had to do a lot of work to figure out that I was dyslexic. Even my teacher, who was one of the best teachers ever, did not know what was wrong. She wanted to help me, but she couldn't because she didn't know how. When we would read a book as a class, when it was my turn to read, I would get the words wrong, and kids would look at me like I'm stupid, but I'm not. I'm dyslexic. A lot of kids with dyslexia feel like they're stupid because they can't read. They feel like an outsider. I did, but I don't anymore because I got the help I needed. I went to the Skank School, where they taught me how to read. The teachers there helped me understand that I was not stupid. I'm a smart kid who just learns a different way. If you pass this bill, then more kids like me can get the help they need. Now I know that dyslexia is a superpower, not a disability. With your help, lots of kids can find their superpowers. I would be happy to answer any questions.
If y'all want to go ahead and move, and we'll let Mrs. Leftwich. Miss, if you go ahead, just pull that microphone over there to you. There you go.
My name is Audrey Jane Leftwich, and I'm a 5th grade student with dyslexia. I am grateful for the opportunity to be here today, and I want to thank you for your efforts in trying to help dyslexic children of Georgia just like me. I struggled to read in 1st grade. I did not understand why my best friend could read so easily, and it was such a struggle for me to read. On most days, I went home from school crying, but my family had the answer. I was lucky to have an older brother with dyslexia. My parents knew the warning signs when I struggled to read. The public school administration knew my parents would not back down until I had the correct accommodations. They made sure I had tutors and extra support in the classroom. Then when it was clear I needed more support than the public school could provide, I was moved to a private school for children with dyslexia. I now read chapter books just like my best friend, and I have confidence I can be successful in anything I put my mind to. I know my story is similar to those you have heard. Our struggles as dyslexic students are similar but very personal. Senate Bill 48 will help bridge the similar issue in the stories of dyslexic children in Georgia. The opportunity for our teachers to have training so they can identify dyslexia in the classroom will stop from them guessing what is going on with struggling readers like me. A state dyslexia handbook will give an understanding of how to help students, not only to teachers but also parents. Kindergarten screening will help students be identified earlier so they can be helped earlier and not suffer from self-doubt and low self-esteem like I experienced. This is an important issue, and I am so grateful to you for helping dyslexic students in Georgia. We need your help, and your actions will ensure understanding of our learning differences in our great state. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, ma'am. We have Matt Galilee. How do you? If I mispronounce your name, you can please certainly. And then next will be Patty Gullick.
Oh, it's okay. I've had a lifetime of mispronunciations with
So
a name
have
like that.
So.
No, I guess I'll give these brave young people that have come up before me. That's pretty awesome testimony. I'm just here to kind of give a parent's perspective. My name's Matt Gallagly, and I'm the parent of a dyslexic child. The first part of my brief story is completely unoriginal. As much as 20% of the population could relate to the first part, but only a tiny sliver could relate to the second part. In this separation lies the opportunity that you guys have before you today. Jack, my son, is a bright, energetic, and creative person. He has an eagerness to learn and enjoys school. This would have been an accurate description of him from the very first day of kindergarten. Very soon after beginning school, my wife began to suspect issues in Jack's ability to recognize written words and to begin the fundamentals of reading. He did not lack for exposure. He was exposed to reading from a very early age. And I, along with the teachers and staff, kind of gave my wife the, "Don't worry, Mom. Kids all learn at different stages. They learn at different rates. He'll be okay." I shouldn't have doubted her intuition. In the sake of time, I'm going to condense 3 years into a short bit. From kindergarten through second grade, we were in a never-ending loop of asking for help and seeking answers as Jack's ability to read fluently began to fall further and further behind his peers. His teachers and the administrators of our public school were supportive and involved. They simply lack the diagnostic ability to properly identify the root cause of the issue and were ill-equipped to remediate the issue even if it was discovered. This loop is where the majority of dyslexic children live out their educational experience. This loop has devastating consequences, as you've heard from some of the children who have testified before me. This is the point at which our experience departs from the typical experience. We eventually had Jack privately tested and were given his diagnosis. Our relief quickly gave way to fear as we realized there were no resources in our area that could effectively help him. As we approached third grade, the transition from read to learn to read helped us know that we needed to do something immediately. In the second half of Jack's third grade year, we made the decision to enroll Jack at Grace Point School in Marietta. This school's designed with the tools to help dyslexic learners thrive. Sorry, I lost my place. This decision came at considerable financial and logistical cost. See, we live in Whitfield County, and we commute Jack 160 miles each day to school. We gladly make this choice. But what about the 3, 4, or 5 other kids that are still sitting in the class that Jack no longer sits in? It should not only be the privileged few that get a chance to succeed. Early, specific identification and implementation of systematic, multisensory techniques for remediation are the keys to success. We stand here today with a chance to change lives. We stand beside you as you take steps to strengthen the support of the dyslexic student in our state. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Patty Gullick, and then we'll have Joe Bastrick. Is that right?
Hi, thank you so much for listening to all of us. I am a parent of 3 children, 2 who are dyslexic. I'm a special educator for the past 25 years. And in my special education, I had no training on dyslexia at all, early childhood, which was birth to grade 8. When my son, who's now 23, started kindergarten, we knew there were issues, and we were living, thankfully, in the state of Hawaii at that time. He was diagnosed. My husband was military. We were moved to San Antonio, Texas, and he was put in a special program for kids with dyslexia. Then we moved here to Georgia. He was in 7th grade, and at that point, everything kind of went bad. He didn't have an IEP or a 504 because they had made accommodation. They had taught him how to read, but at this point, he just needed some extended time and minor accommodations. That took us about a year or 2 to get. And at the same time, my youngest daughter was starting 1st grade, and it runs in families. So so I was in the process of trying to get her dyslexic, so a teacher that knew something about dyslexia. Nothing happened for 5 years. So I paid for private tutoring. In that time, I also became a private tutor and became Orton Gillingham trained. And I will stop talking there. My daughter is now, thankfully, in junior in public school, and because she had 5 years of private tutoring after school, 5 days a week for 1st grade through 3rd grade, because I could afford that, she does very well. She's taking AP classes and in dual enrollment with minor modifications. So anyway, I started to tutor, and this is a student that I tutor, Joe Basserick. So I'll let you talk, Joe.
Hi, my name is Joe. I've been school to school, and some of them, they could not take me because I could not read well, but she helped me read. It took a while, but now I can read at grade level. Actually, in fact, over grade level. Thank you.
Hey, Joe. Thank you, Joe. Catherine McNutt, and then we'll have Laura Warner.
Hi. So when you look at a Star Wars movie, you expect to see the words, and you can't read it that well. That's what it's like every day for me with my dyslexia. Until 1st grade, I was unable to read, not because of a lack of exposure to literature. My mom read to me every day since I was probably a month old. It was because my dyslexia did not allow me to comprehend as well as the others. As soon as I got into the 5th grade, my mom told me that we were going to get a screening done, and I was so thankful for that because that's when we realized I had dyslexia. I didn't think of it as a learning disability. I thought of it as my superpower because it made me different. I was very happy to know this. In the 9 years that I've been in school, I have only met one teacher with the training to know how to identify dyslexia, and that teacher gave me a great deal of hope, knowing that teachers can be able to be taught how to deal with dyslexic kids. I know personally it is a struggle because I am in 4 high school credit classes in 8th grade, and when I tell my teachers I have dyslexia, the looks on their faces tell me everything I need to know. I hope that this bill will help other children like me get the better screening they need and help have them excel in their school life. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Catherine. Ms. Laura Warner, then be Rebecca Collins.
Well, Mr. Chairman and the committee, thank you for allowing us all to speak today. My name is Laura Warner, and I was fortunate to speak to the Senate Study Committee, and I'm glad to speak to you today about this important issue. I was very, very pleased with the outcome of the bill that was unanimously approved by the Senate. I am a Georgia K-5 certified teacher, public school experience, speech-language pathologist, and a proud parent of a daughter with dyslexia. I've been working with children since 1995, and here are some of my observations regarding dyslexia. First, the word dyslexia could not and would not be discussed at a student support team meeting. In a conference with my daughter's public school teacher and administrators, we were told to resign ourselves to the fact that we just have an average student. 2 years later, after testing that we paid for, she was diagnosed with dyslexia. If our public school had recognized that dyslexia exists, and if teachers were trained in dyslexia, we would have been able to help our daughter sooner. Second, professionally, I was very frustrated to see children who showed the signs of dyslexia struggle day in and day out as a first grade teacher. Unfortunately, those students stayed after school, 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and they were given the same type of intervention, the same type of teaching of reading that they had been given that very morning. By screening all kindergarten students, as the Senate bill recommends, we will be able to identify these students and get them the help that they need to put them on the right path to learning. We should be doing something, and it's time to address their needs. And finally, some children get by, like my daughter did, and then they hit the wall in 3rd grade. That's dyslexia. Every child is different, but we can't keep saying it's specific learning disability, or that they'll be okay, or that they're just average. My family was fortunate. We were blessed with the means to get our daughter diagnosed and put her in a private school where she gets the accommodations that she needs to thrive. But this is not an option for a lot of kids who are in public school, and their needs are not being met. So I urge you to adopt the measures spelled out in the Senate bill. Thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Laura. We got Ms. Rebecca Collins, and then is it Jaylene Hunter? Did I say it right?
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak for a moment. I am Catherine McNutt's mother, who spoke to you just a few minutes ago, and I am a K-12 certified teacher here in the state of Georgia. Looking at those two perspectives, Catherine is a brilliant student and always has been. She didn't hit her wall until 7th grade. We had her diagnosed with dyslexia in 4th grade at a private psychologist because we knew something was not quite right. Her oral language was unbelievable. Her comprehension was amazing, but she could not read a book. It would take her 3 hours to sit down and read a book that another child could read in 30 minutes. It still takes her forever to read a book. We do hours of homework a night when it would take another student 30 minutes to an hour to complete. And despite all of that, with the support at home and a few teachers who have an understanding of dyslexia, she's able to excel and be in her 4 high school credit classes. We realize that is not normal for her. Her experience is not normal. And even saying all that, because she doesn't fail, she does not qualify for an IEP, and we have to fight for every accommodation for extra time that she gets. It is only under other health impaired that she qualifies for a 504. We can't even call it a specific learning disability because she doesn't qualify for an IEP because of she doesn't have a discrepancy. So early screening would have helped her immensely, and so we really urge you to support this bill. As a teacher and looking at it, and I teach middle school and I teach a high school credit class, middle school, and teach in high school as well. It's so important that these students have the support. Many of them will be able to get by because they are so bright that they can memorize books, they can memorize what they hear in the classroom, but once they get into higher learning, they start to hit a wall and it becomes very difficult. And so having that screening in place, having teachers be aware of what dyslexia is, what accommodations can be helpful to students with dyslexia, and even small things such as having a copy of notes, having ability to see the presentation online and make sure that it's posted. Those very small things make a huge difference to students with dyslexia. So even though we're talking about a screening in K3, our work is not done until we're reaching all students at all levels who may not have been reached before. So I appreciate your time and I appreciate your work, and I hope you support the passage of this bill.
Okay, well, thank you, ma'am. Ms. Hunter.
Hey, good afternoon. I'll keep this short and sweet because I know everybody wants to get moving. But thanks for your time today. My name's Jaylene Hunter. My husband Mitch and I have 4 boys. We have 2 who are very smart boys with dyslexia and 2 who are still in preschool. And we are public school advocates. We love the system and we love the school that our boys go to. But our experience is not unlike what you've heard. Our wonderful and well-meaning school simply did not know how to help. My son's teacher kept saying to me, I wish I had the tools in my toolbox to help him, but I simply don't. So we went to early morning, summertime tutoring sessions that did not move the needle at all. And the reason is the public school system does not differentiate between dyslexia and other types of reading disabilities and general issues with reading. There was no screening. There was no appropriate remediation to help. And I believe one of y'all were mentioning the RTI. My son's scores went from a 90th percentile to a 35th percentile, and he was not put in the RTI program. When you see a discrepancy that large, there's an issue, right? But my boys are fine. They're smart. They're hardworking. And we had the ability to take them to an educational psychologist. And we got them the right remediation. And so for one of my kids, that remediation meant he went from a reading score of the 35th percentile to the 87th in less than 8 months with the right kind of teaching. My heart just simply aches for the parents who cannot afford to do that for their kids. So it's my hope that y'all please take this seriously. Please consider the merits of the bill. Talk to parents. Talk to adults who have dyslexia. It might be interesting to hear what their experience in school was like. And talk to teachers who are frustrated that they can't help. And I implore you to find a child who was fully remediated through our public school system. I believe from what we've heard today, there was not one who was identified through the public school system from the students and parents you've heard from today. There was also not one that was fully remediated. And I know our teachers and our systems want to change that, and I appreciate y'all's support. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Polly McKinney. Hiding in the corner. There you go.
Hiding behind the pillar. Hi, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, I'm Polly McKinney, Advocacy Director at Voices for Georgia's Children. And there's been a lot said, so I'll just cut to the chase. As a whole child policy shop, I can tell you that one of the things that this bill does, that we get to see a lot of child relevant bills go through the State House and support most of them. But this is one of those ones that can make exponential change. Because not only will it address children with learning disabilities while they're children, but it will carry on into their adulthood and into the workforce. In addition, learning disabilities exacerbate other situations that children have. So if you have a child who is suffering trauma, or you have a child who has another disability, another sort of disability, the learning disability just makes everything all the much worse. So of course we're very supportive of this legislation and all the work done, and appreciate all the folks who are here today, especially the children. But the other thing I will lead you with is a few years ago, Deloitte did a study for the Georgia Literacy Commission that had the Georgia Chamber and Literacy for All, and the First Lady was one of the co-chairs. I mean, it was kind of a big deal. And their study found that 1 in 6 adults in our state is low literate. And I can only leave this thought with you, is that if we had known what we know now a decade or two ago, or even 5 years ago, I think that number would not be as adverse as it is. And with that, I urge your support of the bill, and thank you.
Thank you, Polly. Michael O'Sullivan, and then lastly is Sita Cook.
Hi there, Michael O'Sullivan from Georgia Can, and I first want to say that I am very appreciative of SREB and their work that they did. Their report I thought was well researched and just provides a great roadmap for Georgia, and please read it. This legislation hits many of those benchmarks and the benchmarks that are important to us, primarily ensuring that every kid is identified as early as possible and given the support, and helping teachers in ensuring that they are prepared, trained, and identify ways to not only identify their students, but train to help give them support. Just real briefly, the talk about 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 kids. I mean, you are talking about in an average classroom, 4 to 5 kids in every classroom that has dyslexia, and so this is something that is across the board going to be an issue. This is legislation that across the board will have benefits, and I urge your support. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Ms. Cook, do I have to warn you to be brief?
I appreciate being, I just looked at my watch.
You're the last one.
I understand, so
no, Mike Chokas is the last one.
I'm going to do the very quick, just high points, leaving out the wonderful story about my niece. But there are 4 lessons that I think synthesize a lot of what we've heard, and it may help to hear that at this point. First is not to make assumptions about the academic and intellectual potential of those whose brain gives them an extra challenge for reading, but not necessarily for thinking. With some allowances, such as more time for tests, many should be able to participate in advanced classes, as we've heard. So if the bill has some way to warn people, DOE can follow up. Second, I would hope that once there has been a determination that an individual has some form of dyslexia, no one neglects checking for other special needs, whether it's a need for glasses, support with home problems, or anything else. At the same time, please encourage schools to offer other forms of assessments to avoid squeezing some students with reading problems into an inaccurate assumption of the presence of dyslexia. I'm thrilled about the bill. It's wonderful to be bipartisan in the fullest sense, but we want to make sure it's not misdone. Third, it is never, ever too late to help someone with dyslexia. Please do not neglect those who are in middle or high school especially, and maybe even some adult school employees who could use some support. Finally, as has been mentioned already today, the use of supportive and accurate terminology can make a big difference. No one should say, for example, as I heard at an earlier meeting, that a child has failed a screening test. That language can make it look hierarchical in a way it's not. The message to the children in a class or in a family is equally important, so that they don't think of somebody as being inferior. There's less bullying and all those kinds of things. Now you don't say that in a bill, but I think if things can be done in that spirit, and I like the concept of coming back in a year or 2 years in order to figure out how it needs to be done even better. So
yes,
thank you.
Thank
and
you,
it's 2 minutes past.
Atta girl. Representative Chokas, you had something you wanted to say.
About the bills?
Yes, but I thought you wanted to talk about this subject matter, and then.
Oh yeah, there was one point that I wanted to make earlier when the children were talking, and my youngest daughter had similar reading issues, and we found after she had been, we had a specialist help in the tutorials and so forth. But we found out later that her listening skills and learning through listening skills went through the roof. So when you talk about having superpowers, you guys really do have superpowers. And that's not, I mean, and that's a fact. But with that being said, thank you to the young people for sharing their stories. It really is a powerful message. And now on to...
Just 1 second. We have one more question or comment by a committee member. Ms. Becky.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a question. I think it might be more to Dr. McGivney, but maybe some of you can answer it, and this may be more for long-term questions. But I'm wondering, has our method of training teachers changed significantly in that? Yes. Okay, that's what I think, because I feel like the problem has gotten worse. Like, since I have kids that are in their mid-20s, and my oldest kids had like an older teacher, I called her a master teacher, and they didn't have problems, but my daughter has. She's a diagnosed dyslexic. But anyhow, so I'd like to learn a little bit more about that and really make sure we encourage our teaching schools to teach teachers correctly. So I'll leave it at that.
He's waiting on you in the back corner. And we have to, I'll make just a real quick comment, and then we have to assign some bills to a committee, a technical thing. But for those folks in the audience, we always tell anybody that listens to us or comes here, take time to contact your representative. I mean, it's nice to contact me and send me 100 emails, but there's somebody that represents you here, one of the state representatives. It would be good to just a nice personal comment, not a reproduced one that some organization sends out. But I've got some real nice ones from young people and parents both, and it makes a better difference than just copy and paste. And I think that would be something good that I think everyone could do in the next few days. But Vice Chairman Chokas, would you assign some bills to some subcommittees?
Absolutely. Is it on? Okay, good. We'll start with House Bill 558. It goes to academic support. House Resolution 52 goes also to academic support. Senate Bill 15, academic support. Senate Bill 60, academic support. Senate Bill 83, academic achievement. Senate Bill 108, academic achievement. And Senate Bill 163 is academic innovation. And the last one is Senate Bill 219, also academic innovation.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Sure appreciate that. And that concludes our meeting, and we are adjourned. Thank you all for being here.